Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back. This is the final episode in a series that looks at various forms of shared living. The first featured a fun discussion about the Golden Girls. The second examined alternative forms of housing beyond the typical apartment, condo, townhouse, and house. If you're a frequent listener, you know that I think that the so-called American dream of owning a home is overrated, much like marriage. Nonetheless, in the third episode here, we look at an innovative product that can be used by solos as a way to afford home ownership, or it could be used for a business or investment opportunity. Our guest is Michael Koenig. Michael is the president and co-founder of Studio Shed. For over 13 years with Studio Shed and now over 25 years of entrepreneurship, he has started and grown innovative companies. Studio Shed started by offering beautifully designed alternatives to barn-style sheds that could be used as, for example, a home office or a studio, but it has grown into much more than that, as you'll learn. Our guest co-host is Darlene Savoy. Darlene hails from the east coast of Canada and has recently returned to live there after a 20-year hiatus. Like me, she's a self-described late bloomer, but unlike me, she aspires to create solo-friendly co-housing development. You may be familiar with her as a guest co-host on the recently launched episode Reinvention with Arlene Dickinson, and as a guest on the previous episode on shared living. This episode has a different flavor than a typical one. But if you want to better understand the so-called housing crisis, if you want to think differently about home ownership, and if you care about the challenges facing multi-generational living, which often includes a solo, for example, a grandparent or an adult child, you might enjoy nerding out with us. Note, Studio Shed is not a sponsor of the podcast, but I love the product, I love the company, and I love Michael, so I feel comfortable extolling its virtues unabashedly here. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Let's get started. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, we're going to see. And welcome back, Darlene.
Hi, Peter.
This is your third time back, Darlene.
Yeah. Do I have the record, or is there
Not
a
even
record
close.
holder? Okay.
Speaking of thirds, this is the third installment of our look at alternative housing for solos. That is, alternatives to the typical apartment, condo, or houses. Our first episode kicked off talking about the Golden Girls, the cultural phenomenon known as the Golden Girls, and how their living situation has been inspirational for a lot of solos, especially as they consider their golden years. And so, Darlene, maybe we'll start with a little recap of the second installment, which was with you and Ben Lowe, where we talked about shared living. And one of the things about that shared living episode, which, by the way, I loved, I thought it was fantastic. Thank you. Mm-hmm. But there were some options that we talked through that I think is going to be relevant to the conversation that we're going to have with Michael. And can you hit the kind of highlights of some of these other shared living offerings and options?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to make it simpler and more complicated, they all start with co.
Yes.
I don't know whether that makes it easier or more complicated. But we started off with roommates, which everybody knows what that is. We kind of went into what's called co-living, which is kind of a deviation of that, where it's usually managed. There's lots of those coming up on the market these days all around the world. And then there's something called co-ops, which has a couple of different variations. One's kind of almost government sponsored. The other one's kind of another type of co-living arrangement. And then we had co-housing, which is kind of the most committed version, where you all have separate dwellings. You usually have to plan it a lot, and develop it yourself, and then you all live kind of on the same property.
And I have a feeling that last one is going to be most relevant to Michael's business. By the way, just everyone should know this. Michael is a dear friend. And so if things get a little feisty here,
Which they may.
You're going to know why. But one of the beautiful things about being friends with him is that I was in on the ground floor, so to speak, when he launched this business 10, 12?
Yeah, 2008.
Yes. Okay. So even more. And so we were actually living together for about 6 to 8 weeks one summer when he was really hatching many of these ideas and getting this idea
That's right. Yeah.
going. And so let's talk a little bit about the evolution.
Were we cohabitating? Or were we roommates? What were we?
I'm surprised to hear that Peter was living with somebody.
Well,
oh my
okay, so we were living together. We were roommates. I was occupying a bedroom in his house because I was in between residents at the time. So I had been kicked out of my apartment by the landlord because she wanted to move in, not because of the parties I was throwing. And I went to Europe for like a month.
That's right. Yeah.
And I put all my stuff in storage, and I didn't have a place to come to when I came back. And so I lived with Michael for 6 to 8 weeks. It was a magical summer. I launched a whole bunch of ideas. It was really wonderful. And then I moved into an apartment, and then I later bought a house.
The summer of thinking big.
It was a big thinking summer. Yes, indeed. And so how did Studio start? Where did the idea come from? And how is it evolving?
I always love telling this story. To me, it never gets old. So the co-founder, Jeremy, who Pete also knows, is a very good friend of mine. I've known Jeremy since probably 1999. We met each other in the cycling world. And they had a small ranch-style home in Boulder, actually not far from where Pete ended up buying a house. And their garage was small. It was like a 3-bedroom, 1,200 square foot ranch-style house. And their garage was overflowing with bikes. And so Jeremy needed a storage shed in his backyard, and he just didn't like what was on the market. Really, the only things, and even still today, are these kind of barn-style sheds. So he
tough shed.
A tough shed, yeah.
That kind of thing.
So he designed and built really the first studio shed, if you could call it that at that time, back in 2004. So I helped him finish it up, and I was like, oh my God, this thing is so cool. It's just a great looking backyard shed. In a small yard, you want something that's aesthetically pleasing. And so I put one in my backyard, and over the next few years, I just happened to take notice of all the comments that we both would get at backyard barbecues. Oh, where'd you get that? Or, wow, that's so cool. And, well, no, you can't have it because we just built them ourselves. So I was actually wrapping up a business. I did some research. Jeremy and I were sitting around one day enjoying a beer after a big bike ride. And I said, hey, I've been doing some research, and I think that if we can manufacture these and make them in a way so that we can ship them anywhere, and it's a panelized system like Legos for adults, I think we might have something here. And so we started off with a crappy little website, and that was in 2008, and we had 3 models, three sizes, 120 square feet, 140, and 160. We always knew that we actually designed these and built these with the intent that people would end up finishing them out. We always knew, and that's kind of how we came up with the name. Hey, you can use it as a shed, or you can use it as a studio. So we immediately built them to residential grade construction. And so the only difference would be like, hey, if you want to convert it into a studio, then you would just replace the glass and do a couple of other things, or we would ship that kit. So it got legs very quickly. We got some press, and immediately we started right off the bat. Like, it was like, hey, I'm gonna make this a finished space. So within 6 months, we launched the lifestyle interior kit, which is a whole kit of parts and pieces, the finished flooring, the electrical wiring, everything to create a studio. We also started getting requests for larger units. Hey, can you do a garage? Or I want to build a small backyard home. I want to put a bedroom in there, maybe a kitchen. That was the evolution of what is called our Summit series. So we have 3 product lines today. We have the Signature series, which is small backyard studios. They go up to about 200 square feet. Great for a home office, recording studio. Then the second product line is a gable roof, and I think that thing goes up to 600 square feet. The Summit series is where we are seeing a lot of growth, and we'll talk about that here in a bit, but that's really you've probably heard of accessory dwelling units or backyard cottages or granny suites. They're called different things in different parts of the country, but the most popular and getting more popular name is an ADU. So that is a fully, those ones currently we can go up to 1,000 square feet, kitchens, you can do up to 2 bedrooms in those, and we ship everything. So yeah, and then we trademarked Studio Home a couple years ago, and we were going to launch last year, but we got pretty busy with the pandemic. So we're actually launching Studio Home in Q1, maybe early Q2 of next year. And that's going to be smaller homes trying to fill that gap with the lack of product out there for this size home. We've actually built several homes already where people are just linking units together. We've gone through all the trials and tribulations over the past almost 14 years, and we're feeling very good about Studio Home and ultimately trying to help solve some of the demand issue right now with housing.
Yeah. And so I want to make a couple quick comments just as a layperson who got to observe this. So one of the very cool things about this is the very basic studio shed unit. You often don't need a permit to do this at the smaller sizes. So this can be a very low cost way to add space to an existing home, so to speak.
That's right,
And a regular run-of-the-mill general contractor can put it together, or a savvy DIY person can put it together. So it's amazingly low cost in terms of the construction, and it's very easy to do. You could get it together in a day.
It probably would take, for a finished unit, it'd be 4 to 5 days.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing that I think is very interesting about it. The ease, the speed, and the lower cost, because, a permit can be expensive in certain places like California and so on. The next thing that I think is very interesting is what I liked about it as a business school professor is that it competes simultaneously with the low-cost gross option, the tough shed, right, the barn-style shed, and with the expensive fancy option, which is to renovate your home. Oh, we need more space. We have a newborn, we have a home office, whatever. Adding to a house is incredibly expensive. Instead, you can drop this into your backyard.
The whole thing sounds amazing. I mean, when you're describing the different types of uses, Mike, laneway houses, would that be another one? That
Sure.
seems to be really popular in certain cities in Canada right
What's
now.
a laneway house?
alley. Is that alley homes?
Well, I think it's essentially the
In
same
America,
thing.
it's an alley home. In Canada, it's a laneway home.
Laneway?
There's going to be a lot of translation during this podcast. Yeah, I think it's the same thing. It's just that they've changed the zoning laws because of the housing crisis, and they're allowing people to put these houses into their lanes, I guess, their alleys or wherever.
Well, I think that's brilliant. And by the way, we just launched in Canada this year. It took us forever to figure out.
Oh, you did?
the
Okay, cool.
customs or freight or something,
Yeah.
but we did it. And but I think what's really interesting about our product and a lot of other products out there that people starting to see, whether it's design build ground up or some other competitor or whatever it is, it's also great is this thinking about urban infill in a new and fresh way. Like there's so much dead space in cities that can be repurposed, and oddball lots and laneways or alleys, and I just think it's really neat.
And it was all illegal up until a certain point, and then I guess just because of the issues we're having with shortages, something had to give, I guess. So.
Well, I also know that they passed new legislation up there in regards to accessory dwelling units as far as zoning goes, because historically this is years ago, they've been very hard to do all over the country to pull a permit for them.
That's right. Yeah, Toronto and Vancouver, they've just recently changed a lot of their zoning laws. It's happening here too. I mean, it's just a necessity,
Yeah.
It's a necessity.
Let's talk about that necessity. So you use that term housing crisis. I hear this term a lot. And so for me, one of the interesting things, because housing is so regulated by the government, it often will inhibit innovation. When the options are, I'm sure it's 90% of people live in an apartment, condo, or house in North America or in Europe. Where's this crisis? Where is it coming from? What's happening? Let's understand this before we can talk about how to solve it and how to solve it specifically for solos. Yeah,
so I had a very interesting, illuminating call with a professor out of, I forget, actually he's retired because he has a little tiny book, but he talks about just this and why we're here. And now I recall that, 100 years ago, there was way more multi-generational living going on. Grandparents, parents, and kids, and relatives. I mean, there were more people living in one dwelling. And then, as we've seen over the past 100 years, people are all over the place, right? They've moved out. They don't necessarily want to live with their parents because everybody living in the same walls, just things have changed, right? And they just don't want to do it. And so people are transient, and there's a lot of moving going on. I think that that is part of the problem. As far as the number of, the last report I read is that the U.S. is 6 million doors short of where we need to be for housing. And by doors, we're talking about a door to a dwelling, right? And that can be an apartment, a condo, a townhouse, or a house, or some other structure. So I think that's one of the issues. I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about that sort of 100-year span and how things have changed. I suspect that that's part of the problem. The other is the immediate problem is there's a labor shortage. There was a construction labor shortage before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. That has become even worse, right? So,
and then there's the shortage of materials.
Supply, yeah. Right.
I'll add something else, and I don't have data on this, but it's something that I've observed is, and this is especially the case in the United States, is because Americans love to make money buying and selling homes to each other. Mm-hmm. And so you get a lot of, we call it, NIMBYs, not in my backyard. So now you buy a house, let's use Boulder as an example. You buy a house in Boulder, and it becomes a popular place, right? So one of the things that we're seeing, this is related to what you were saying, Michael, is, right, so you have, first of all, you have more singles in the world than you did 50 years ago. They're more mobile than ever before. And they're even more mobile now because you can work at Twitter and live wherever you want. So what do? You go, well, I don't need to live in Springfield anymore. I'm going to move to Boulder. I'm going to move to Denver. I'm going to move to Los Angeles. I'm going to move somewhere warm. I'm going to move somewhere that's has outdoor activities, that has other people kind of like me, and so on. But if you already own a home in one of those places and you have this influx of people, it raises your house value, which is quite good. And then anybody who comes along and says, well, we want to build this building because we need space, folks go, no. Right? And so it sort of artificially constrains the market. It doesn't allow a market to sort of operate efficiently, which is there's demand for housing. Now there are people who want to develop it. And so you have locals in government that says, no, you can't do that. You can't build too high. You can't do all these kinds of things.
Yeah. And see, but what I don't understand is it feels like the vacancy rates for rentals have gone down to virtually zero everywhere. It's just what it feels like. I mean, maybe the statistics would be different, but it just feels like how can there be shortages everywhere? Where's the population moving from? That's what I don't understand. Where are the places where the vacancy rate has gone up? And it just feels like there's this sense of scarcity almost everywhere.
It's not everywhere, though. And I know this because I have a colleague at the University of Colorado who basically says there are sort of 5 different types of housing markets in the United States. And there are a bunch out there that are really depressed. If you want to live cheap and you want to live in one of those places, you can do it. It's just there's a reason it's depressed. You know what I mean? So that, there's that, right. And so, but that said, it's not the major metropolitan areas. The cities are thriving in that way. Okay, so this crisis, this issue, this problem, it's a problem. It has multiple determinants that are there. And one of the things I want to talk about with the two of you especially is, okay, how are these kind of other ways to solve it? That might be cooperating with government or might be kind of entrepreneurial of sorts. So let's use Studio Shed and Studio Home as a case study, Michael, if I may. right? So
Sure. I think actually, just to speak to the government, I mean, so Portland was the first to pass, it was either Portland or Seattle that overhauled their zoning for backyard homes, right? The accessory dwelling units. And then California followed suit and they passed AB 68. And I believe that was 2, maybe 3 years ago. What that did is it eliminated single family zoning. So you can have up to 3 individual units theoretically on most properties not all, but many in California. So you can convert your garage into an ADU. You can you can put another ADU on your lot if it'll fit. And then of course you have your house. Mm-hmm. So now you have 3 structures on a property. They were okay with the parking issues, which can be something like in Boulder. So I think from a governmental standpoint that they get it. I mean, you have Freddie Mac sending newsletters mentioning ADUs. I see it like once a month. So that's interesting to me, right? That it's what we're talking about is urban infill.
Let's talk about a case study then, right? Mm-hmm. Let's use this example, right? So let's suppose you own a home or you're considering buying a home. And so how might you approach this situation, whether it be, let's say, from a multi-generational standpoint or perhaps from an investment standpoint, right? Because one of the things I like to criticize, as I say, like, I'm not anti-home buying. I just think it's overprescribed. But one of the benefits of buying a home is it's forced savings, right? And so it's a way for people who might not otherwise save money to save money, and it's an investment that you live in, so it's a twofer. And so I have a quite reasonable view of this, I think. So let's talk about, you have a potential to buy a home, but then you can also put 1 or 2 other structures on there. Let's talk through 2 case studies. One, a multi-generational one that might involve some solos, for example, like a widowed grandparent or a 20-something, who's not quite ready to launch. And then let's talk about it from someone who might be a solo, who might be thinking about one of these alternative forms of shared living.
I'm not going to say we've seen all the case studies, but we've seen all of those and more over the years. We've even seen the Golden Girls.
Perfect. Let's talk through some of these. What does it look like?
So let's start with the Golden Girls. So we have an ADA option, accessibility option.
What does that mean?
So it's ADA is what you see. It's the bars, in the bathrooms. It's the tub that you can walk into. It's
accessible.
ADA, yeah, American Disability Act. I think is what it is.
Yeah, early '90s. That was acronym. A major landmark. Clinton passed it.
Yeah. So it doesn't take much to. I'm not even say convert. You just install these things in the home, and then you can also do. So if the children want to monitor, say there's an aging Alzheimer's father in the backyard, you can have a video, make sure everything's okay back there.
Oh my God! I'm not going to make a joke right now.
No,
go on.
Okay, so the Golden Girls, they're 3 widows, and one of them owns a home. And she was in Northern California, and her friends are they're kind of getting lonely, right? And they don't want to go into nursing homes. So they ended up just putting 2 of these ADUs in the backyard. And they have this, it's almost like a hacienda where they're positioned, there's the one in the front and then the 2 flanking in the back, and there's a courtyard in the middle. So they all have their own space. They can have, their grandkids come and visit and have a space for their grandkids to stay. And then they can also commune in any of the units or outside there. So we've seen that. That is actually so that's the Golden Girls. We've also seen, one of our employees I shouldn't say this has happened yet, but he wants to build an ADU in his parents' backyard to have his own space. And he's younger, right? Graduate of CU. I think he's probably 27 and can't afford a home. And that seems like a great option for him. And that we've done a ton of that over the years, where it's either the parents getting rid of their big suburban home, downsizing, and so that's a huge demographic group that is downsizing and trying to figure out a smaller, smarter way to live, the boomers. Moving back in with their kids. I mean, we probably do one of those cases every couple weeks. So you've got that, and then you have, so we call that, it's just multi-generational living. And often the middle generation has kids, right? So then and I think, by the way, I think that is so beautiful.
That's like the Modern Family version of
right.
this.
And it's, I mean, I see what's happening with my own parents living in suburban Virginia, and they have this big house, and they're just kind of, I'm like, man, if I could figure out, I'm not sure I'd want them out here, but I've been talking to my brother. I'm like, hey man, you should put an ADU in your backyard. He's like, well, I don't need one. We already have a guest suite. And I've talked to my parents. I said, great, get them over there. Like I don't know. There's just something about families coming back together that I think is very sweet.
Before we get to the third case study, there is something, and you alluded to it earlier, and that is people don't like to share walls with their family members. They often don't like sharing their walls with anyone.
Right.
But
this is
the
nothing
thinner
new.
the wall, the less they want to share it.
This is why this still happens in other countries. I call it hacienda style living, where you have multiple units of individual homes on a property. And usually these people congregate, these families congregate in the main, sort of the middle generation, the big kitchen and cooking and hanging out, and the kids are running around all over the place. And
it does sound a lot like co-housing, really.
Yeah.
Right? And have you ever, fulfilled an order from a group of people who were talking about creating a co-housing development, per se? Because that seems to be gaining popularity as well.
Yes, so that is one of our target markets. It's really the studio home. One of the strategies there is to target, say, developers and builders, or individual investors who want to build they're called different things around the country, but pocket communities, cluster cottage communities, micro communities, right, where you have an acre of land and you have 3 or 4 different size units. Maybe some of them are duplexes. And you can pack a lot of units, a smaller yard, so everybody has their own yard. And then there's a common building or common building with maybe, I don't know, maybe a little pool or whatever it is, or community garden, so that there's shared parking. Maybe
I want
some
a fire
of the units,
pit. Can I have
a fire pit? Yeah, there you go. Cornhole.
Hot tub.
Yeah, so that's sort of one of the objectives with Studio Home, and we've already been talking to developers and kind of maybe thinking about doing it ourselves.
And is there a lot of competition with tiny homes? Because that seems to be popular.
Yeah, great question. We get that question a lot, and it's because some people refer to what we're doing as tiny home. Technically, a tiny home is mobile. It's on wheels. It's like it's a trailer.
Yeah.
And
it seems to be a lot smaller than some of yours as well.
They're much smaller because they can only be typically 8'6" wide.
They're tiny.
And part of me is like, what?
That's the name.
Yeah, like people building their own tiny homes that don't, by the way, most of them don't meet any sort of Department of Transportation safety, right? Things. I mean, you can't be I'm like, just buy an RV, buy a trailer.
Personally, I'm not a big fan. It feels a little bit like you're trying to live in a dollhouse.
It's an Instagram phenomenon. Come on, people. Let's be honest.
It's a hipster thing.
It's not a great solution.
No.
Hey, listen though, I heard that Portland, because of the housing issue, I like to call it an issue, maybe not a crisis. I've heard that they're actually going to allow these as permanent residents and start building out more modern style parks, RV parks for these
The tiny homes, you mean?
Which is pretty cool.
Okay.
Like in Boulder, you can't park one for more than 2 days in front of your house. So the tiny homes on wheels. What we're doing is it's basically residential construction. It's permanently affixed to the ground. It becomes part of if it's permitted, it becomes part of your real estate, right? So you're inherently adding a ton of value to your home.
Your model almost sounds a little IKEA-esque. You package it all up.
Without the fighting.
Yeah, like the IKEA model.
Yeah, IKEA's,
for houses.
Legos. I like to say Legos.
Legos are way cooler than IKEA, yeah. So 2 things to follow up on. I'm on top of this. let's get back to that third case study about a home and a lot, and then we're gonna return. You had the Golden Girls, you had Modern Family. Is there a third case study for owning a home and having a studio shed or a studio home on that space?
Well, sure, there's a plethora of case studies, but I mean, to simplify it, I guess, into one, it would probably be suitingly for this this podcast, if you're single and you're interested in the real estate market and you don't have dual income, that mortgage could be challenging. Granted, interest rates are low, and that's all good and fine. But if it were me and I was buying a single family home, I'd find the place that I wanted to live, and I'd shop for the right home, and I would do the due diligence to make sure that I could put something in the backyard that I could immediately rent out and start generating revenue from. Okay. So I suppose that could be a third case study.
That's good.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
So if I'm understanding you correctly, so for example, my home in Boulder, which I have a renter in right now, because I don't even want to live in it. I don't want to deal with it. But what I could have done at some point, instead of having roommates, so Darlene has a roommate in her apartment right now. Instead of having a roommate, what I could do is I could have built a studio home, studio shed, built out in my backyard, and I put a roommate back there. Basically, I put a renter back there, and that takes the pressure off the mortgage for me. And I don't have to share a wall. I don't have to deal with it.
Like some people put in a basement suite, or they add on to their house to rent it out for extra income.
That kind of thing.
This is another option. Mm-hmm.
And so this is a perfect pivot, actually, into this idea of solos who might want to use a house as an investment, but as you're talking about, Michael, finds it prohibitive, right? It ramps up the risk, right? Because you're a single person, and so on. So you're describing right now a situation where someone who was very entrepreneurial could buy a plot of land, could populate that land with 3 to 10 studio homes, build that common space, and essentially create a community, the kind of community that Darlene and our previous guest, Ben, would be interested in being part of and developing and so on. It could be co-op. It could be built around some common interest and so on.
Yeah, or maybe you hate your job and you have a little bit of a nest egg that you want to start investing. So we actually, one of our customers just purchased, he is single, and he's I think he's a little older, and he just purchased his 7th ADU for his 7th Summit series from us. He's just buying he's just buying properties and putting these in the backyard. So he started with 1, 2, and 3, and now he's 7, and he's just renting these out and building this portfolio. He's like a mini BlackRock.
Yeah, it's incredible. Actually, so to me, I don't know a lot about this, and I have zero interest in owning anything. But if you wanted to try to build wealth through real estate, what you're offering people, Mike, I don't want this to sound like an infomercial, but and Darlene will check me on this if I'm incorrect. The idea that you could buy a house and then you drop one of these units or 2 of these units into the backyard suddenly adds so much value and decreases your risk. Like it's an amazing hedge there, because you can have multiple tenants on the same property.
Yeah, especially with all the changing policies, like the cities are rezoning to allow for that. Wasn't always possible to do that.
That's the key.
Yeah.
That it's easy to pull the permit and do it. And whether it's us or somebody else, if you want to get into real estate, that is I think it's a good option.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of doing it myself, actually. I've been starting to look at some properties in Denver.
Are these, speaking of being in Canada, are these suited for cold weather?
Yes. Yes, we can accommodate any zone. At like literally.
All the new standards, like passive, net zero, I don't know all the lingo, but all of that. Do you guys adhere to any of those standards
We
as
do,
well?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, California passed net zero
Yeah, I figured you
a
would.
couple of years ago, and we were on top of that. And,
Mm-hmm.
in Canada, we would just, it all comes down to the R factor, the insulation, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the roof might be a little thicker up there. But it's, yeah, energy efficiency. It's
That's great.
it's in our DNA here with
Yeah.
everybody that works and everybody that works here.
Darlene, they have special shelving for the maple syrup also.
Yes.
And special, covers so that the beavers can't get through. And
Yeah, and the grizzly bears and
That's right.
and the
bear
sea
proof.
lions.
Yeah, good. I'll order 3.
So one of the things that we were discussing before is, as someone considers housing generally and alternative housing like this specifically, we have our 5 C's. And so I'd like to sort of talk through these 5 C's before we pivot into some advice and wrap up. So we have cost. So I think we've covered that pretty nicely. One of the great things about these kind of units are they're much lower cost. They're has lower building costs because you might not have to, depending on size, pull a permit. You might not need the same skilled labor. You might
Don't
be able
need
to
an
do
architect.
You don't need an architect, etc. So these are way, way, way lower costs.
Right.
There.
I did a quick Google. I looked on his website. I mean, they are significantly less expensive than I don't know if you want to get into specifics, but I mean, yeah.
Well,
I mean, it depends on your options.
There's really 2 main reasons why we're able to offer this very high quality product at the price that we do. And look, the past year has been pretty difficult on materials, but we still are way below your average square foot price in nearly every major metropolitan area as far as build costs go. And really the 2 main reasons are all the architectural fees and engineering fees and all these things that you have to assume, even for a small structure, they're gone. We don't need an architect, right? So that's the first. The second is the majority, 98% of our supply chain is one step direct to manufacturer. So Marvin Windows and Doors is example. We order direct from them. So there's no double markup through a dealer and no GC markup, right? So GCs typically mark materials up 10 to 20% unless it is a fixed bid project, although they are baking their profit into the project.
All right, let's keep moving then. That's clear. There's no debating this, I think. The next is convenience, and we'll put convenience and community together and care together in the next 3, which is if you can put people in close proximity together without them wanting to murder each other because they're sharing walls, you can then use these kinds of options to make life a little more convenient, right? So let's use the example that you had. You have an acre of land. You put 4 of these on there. You have some common space. Now you can have 1 tool shed, right? You have 1 lawn, right? You might have, and Darlene pointed this out last time, you might have fewer cars, right? Now you're sharing cars, for example, and so on. And then you also have a sense of community, right? You have your fire pit, you have your cornhole, you have your hot tub.
Hey, do you guys all want to meet in the courtyard for cocktails later, right?
Yes.
And so you go do that, and then you can go back to your own sanctuary.
Yeah. That's right.
It sounds really wonderful when you call it hacienda. It sounds like so...
I know. It sounds so fancy, doesn't it?
It does. It sounds
It
really...
makes me want to go there.
It has this
does.
image. People wearing linen, know?
Yeah, down in Baja.
Near the beach. Yeah.
And then obviously the care, you talked about the Golden Girls situation. Implicit in this is not just the fact that you might be avoiding loneliness and that you have some company, but like if you fall, if you get sick, if there's someone right there, close by that will step in and you'll step in for them as friends. And so I think this is...
And it seems like you could just, I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying, but if you all of a sudden decided our community now needs a live-in nurse, let's plunk another one of these puppies down
Sure.
right over there and just have them move in.
Nurse,
No
chef, get your own chef. And
now we're cooking with gas.
bartender.
I can get behind this a little bit.
Now Peter's interested.
I think the community thing is so important because it just, I don't know, my own experience, it seemed, especially with the pandemic, and technology, it seems like people, there's just something about watching, you walk through Central Park or some of these towns and you see people playing chess together, right, out in the open. There's just a feeling, right? It seems to me like there is this need, right, and we are social creatures.
Mm-hmm.
We need each other.
Yeah, and there's a balance. I did a whole series on solitude and the benefits of solitude. But what ends up showing up time and time again is you want to, for the average person, even the average solo, you want to avoid the extremes. You don't want total isolation. Very few people are pure loners, but you also don't want to have people around you all the time. So you have loneliness on one end and you have loneliness on the other end. And so loneliness essentially makes you sad and loneliness makes you stressed. And so being able to move into solitude and out of solitude as you like is a really, I think, a wonderful option. I do what I call group solo trips, where I get a group of people together and we may share some space. We may rent an Airbnb or we may all get hotel rooms in the same hotel, but we have these, we're going to meet at 3:00 to go to the museum. Dinner's at 7 tonight. You're on your own otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so
That's
these
great.
things can, balance those kinds of things. And so you're essentially describing this. And then the last thing I think is the multi-generational stuff almost always involves singles, right? It almost either a young single or an old single or simultaneously both. And this is a very nice solution to those. I think it's great.
Yeah. So by the way, as far as your vacation, solo vacation, I've had this idea, this wish, this dream to buy a piece of land up in the mountains, relatively close to a ski resort, but not like right in town. And you'd build a compound, hacienda style compound, and then you can rent the whole thing out to a group. Or if it's a slow season and you just rent out the one bedroom or the studio unit and one person wants to go up there and retreat. Then my idea was, man, we can just open this up to all of our employees that they can, you can just sign up for a weekend with your family. Mm-hmm. And also for folks that want to come into town and have the experience, they can rent them. And then we were like, hey, let's just credit them. If they end up buying, we can just credit them their
That was going to be one of my questions is where could I see these things?
Anywhere.
Because
they're all over the place.
Everywhere.
Come on down to the U.S. and we'll go on a tour.
We'll do a live taping, Darlene, at some point once I have my podcast studio built.
Oh, that'll be fun.
Okay, so the last one is climate. Essentially people who want to reduce their carbon footprint, who want to try to lower their cost to the environment. One thing that we know is that housing is a tremendous contributor to climate change, whether it be building materials, the creation of building materials, or the energy associated with for example, homes are incredibly inefficient, right? Because you are exposed on 5 sides to the environment. So whether it be cooling it or heating it and so on. And so let's talk a little bit about how some of the solutions we've been talking about lower that particular C. So for people who really care about lowering their environmental impact.
Well, I think there's a couple things to discuss here or to talk about, or fact-based, if you will, right? So any new construction has to meet or exceed IBC and has to meet these this energy compliance. And a lot of manufacturers, whether it's windows or doors or even just producing lumber, like they have to just meet certain energy standards. So that naturally forces a company you have to build it. You won't pass inspection if your building doesn't meet or exceed the current code. So that's the first. The second is, yes, of course, the best thing you can do is not just putting, most of our units actually that are going in somebody's backyard, they perform better than the house because the houses might be older. And so just by putting solar panel on your roof of your old home, that doesn't solve anything because that energy still kind of comes, it solves a little bit. I'm not going to say it doesn't, I should say it doesn't solve anything. It solves a little bit, right? Ultimately, So there's HERS rating, right? And so all of our anybody's new construction has to meet this. The interesting thing that we've seen, and we've started to run some analysis on this, is the shift in people's lifestyles, right? They're not commuting on average 30 to 40 miles round trip to work every day. They can work in their backyard. They can do more staycations. They just, there's gas associated with this, right? And the last time I checked, I think our customers have saved something like 12 million gallons of gas. That's more than all the water in the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C. It's a lot of gas, right? So you're just kind of inherently having these lifestyle shifts. Maybe you're riding your bike more up to the coffee shop. You're just, So I think that that's interesting to me. That kind of ties into community, certainly ties into climate, ties into convenience, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great.
Ties into cost, right? It ties into all the 5 C's. I think I got all the 5 C's. I only listed 4. Care, self-care.
Care,
right?
Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, I think I think just the idea is you're reducing a footprint, really, when you get down to it.
Smarter, smaller living.
That's right.
You just don't need a huge house.
Okay, so this is for both of you. I know I'm turning Darlene from a co-host to a guest here, but let's suppose someone has stuck around to the end of this thing through all this wonky talk.
I'm still here.
and they're intrigued by this, and they're thinking about this from an investment standpoint. They're thinking about it from a lifestyle standpoint. They have parents that they have to care for. They're solo caregivers. Perhaps they're a solo parent, and they're anticipating wanting to be an empty nester or wanting to be a semi-empty nester, put the kid in the backyard, so to speak. What are the questions they should be asking? What are the resources that they should be considering as they think about doing something outside of apartment, condo, townhome, home?
Darlene, do you want to?
I don't know if I have any advice. I mean, listening to you speak about this, it's just exciting right now how many options there are out there, because I feel like there's this shift happening. It was happening before the pandemic, but it's definitely happening since the pandemic. And it just seems like, he threw out 3 different other terms that I'd never even heard of before near the beginning of the podcast. What were those 3 you made up for different co-housing terminology that I'd never even heard of before?
Pocket communities, micro communities, cluster cottage. They're called different things around the country.
Yeah, so I don't think I have any advice. I feel like I'm looking for something specific that I haven't found yet. I've watched the webinars about co-living, co-housing. I've joined groups, I've spoken to people, I've read the books, and nothing quite fits what I'm looking for, but I feel like I'm getting warmer, and I feel like there's a lot of people out there doing the same thing.
Well, Darlene, I know a guy who might be able to give you a little bit of a discount.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of exciting options out there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I tend to get a little bit more philosophical, if you will, about these conversations, Pete, and that was very well stated, Darlene, as far as really that leads into my questions that I would have for myself, right? And you kind of really have to go deep into some mentation on this, which is, what do I want? How do I want to live?
Mm-hmm. And with whom, perhaps?
Yes.
Right. That can maybe roll into how, right?
Yeah.
Do I want to live with other people or do I not?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can really think about what it is that I want at a deep level, and you can answer those questions, I think you're going to get certainly way closer to what it is that you want to invest in.
Mm-hmm.
2 or 3 years ago, I don't think I would have even been having this conversation or thinking these thoughts, because I didn't realize the options were out there,
Mm-hmm.
and that there were all these other people thinking this way.
Mm-hmm.
And the more you open yourself up to it, the more you realize there are lots of other people out there going through the same sort of search.
Yeah.
And there's so many ways to answer that question. I mean, you can be somebody who wants to be transient.
Mm-hmm.
And if that is the case and you want a home, the tech that's out there, the real estate tech, from renting your house on VRBO and having cipher locks on your, to get into the unit, and all the resources that are available to be able to do that and own a home, rent it out, Airbnb, and all. We have a ton of units on Airbnb, by the way. It's super cool.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I think that that's easier than it ever has been, and that's pretty exciting, right? It's, you're not forced to stay in a hotel kind of thing, but
Yeah.
But the second question, I think that's the second or third maybe, is financing. How am I gonna buy the house? How am I gonna afford the ADU? We're one of the few companies now that actually has financing options. We've partnered with an amazing fintech firm called Acorn. The CEO is this guy Geary, who's just so smart and fun. And they've really helped us launch this within our site. It's all handled through them, but there's, HELOC options. And so what most people do is actually leverage. So they buy the home, interest rates are low, right? Assuming your credit score is decent, and there's lots of different ways to skin that cat. But then you use a HELOC to build the ADU in your backyard. Then you refinance the whole thing.
Yeah. A HELOC is a home equity line of credit. So it's basically taking the value of the home as equity in which you can then borrow against for short-term, slightly higher interest rates than you would have for a mortgage.
And some banks now will actually loan you. They'll increase your mortgage to fund the construction of the future ADU. Usually that requires plans and plan sets and things like that. And we and some other companies, you can furnish those at closing or before closing. So I think obviously money is part of it. And then at least right now, today, money is still cheap, and it's a little strange. Interest rates are still at zero.
It's crazy.
That's a whole other solo episode, I think.
It's terrifying.
Yeah, I think once you can answer, really it's those first two, I think the third is obviously very important.
Well, the third is, how am I going to do this? Once I know what I want, how am I going to pull this off?
Well, with our company, it's quite easy because we do the bulk of the work, right? We'll do the whole plan set and communicate with the city, and we have a good and getting better database where you can enter your zip code in our design center, our configurator. We have this online 3D tool. You can enter your zip code and you can actually see what you can or can't do in your area. So, for example, if you enter a Redwood City, California zip code, okay, generally speaking, in this area, you can do an ADU up to 780 square feet in your backyard. So that's that. So we try to make it as easy. It's taking a ton of work, and it's like I said, good and getting better. But we try to take a lot of the painful process. Like when you start talking permits with a homeowner who's never done a construction project before, it is super intimidating and wildly confusing. So hey, it's not a problem. We've got it, right? Yeah. So we keep them focused on. We try to keep folks focused on the vision, where they started, right? Those first two questions. I want a sanctuary in my backyard that my parents can come and visit, and they don't have to. Jerry and Maude Seinfeld aren't going to bother the shit out of me in my kitchen. They're going to have their own space with their coffee maker and dishwasher. Yeah.
But then you must still have to plan things like, potentially a well and, all the things
sure.
That you have to hook.
I don't know where you're. Yes, up in Canada, I think you guys are mostly having to dig wells for water.
Well, if you're rural, you would have to. But if you're near the city, you'd actually have to be on the city water.
Yeah.
All right, we're getting a little deep here.
You're getting out.
I'm going to bring this wonderful conversation to a close. I hope that people find it inspirational, and I think it's really a great way to solve a lot of different problems. So, for example, if you do want the American dream or the North American dream, we've talked about some ways that you might be able to do this. If you want to try to value community and want to do so in a way that is sort of alternative than the existing offerings, Studio Shed or other companies like this are providing, I think, a very nice pathway for people to do it. I would not be surprised if when we check back in a few years, Darlene is running a bunch of these things. I wouldn't be surprised at all.
I hope so.
So Darlene, as always, it's just lovely to see you. I appreciate all the help getting this together. Michael, we've been talking about this for 13 years
I
now.
know.
And it's really fun to see what you've done with it. I'm proud to have you as a friend and to see what value you're creating in the world and to see you thriving as an entrepreneur doing this. You always have enthusiasm about this project, and I think it's just a really wonderful case study about how business can do good, because when you keep your eye on the important problems and pain points that people have, and that you have a healthy dose of entrepreneurship and design chops and persistence, you're able to really solve a major issue that is out there in the world. And I think for the solos listening, I just think it's a really great way to go, oh, maybe I don't have to just live in an apartment, or I have to live in a condo. There are other ways that I can go about creating a shared living environment or a solo living environment that I can afford. And so with that, I want to say thank you to both of you.
Thank you, Pete.
Thank you, Peter.
It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. For more about our guests and show notes, go to petermcgraw.org. Please subscribe and share with your single friends.